Vasudevaya.
Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
And today is the 11th of June, 2007. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.
Okay, so this is the last day, I think. Tomorrow I'm leaving. We finished the chanting seminar last night, so I thought this morning we could do a new one. We'll talk about cleanliness. That's an important factor in devotional service, and one that Prabhupada always stressed very much. So it'd be nice to look and see a few items on that, what Prabhupada had to say. One time when I was with Prabhupada, when he mentioned this to a life member, we were in Mahabaleshwar, which is a hill station, which is just north of Pune and south of Bombay. Prabhupada had been invited up there, and he was staying at the house of Mr. Malhotra. So Mr. Malhotra had been around the West a little bit. He'd visited some of our temples in Hawaii and New York and London and other places like that. And he'd been to a few places in India as well. So he was telling Srila Prabhupada, he said that, you know, one thing I have found, that there is spotless cleanliness in your centers. Whereas our temples in India, even when we go to Haridwar and Rishikesh and all these places, temples, the outer cleanliness is no proper emphasis is given by the management. So Prabhupada smiled, he said, yes, he said, I stress on this cleanliness very much. If they keep unclean, I chastise them like anything. He was laughing. He said, they have learnt this art. I always say, cleanliness is next to godliness. So that Prabhupada was very keen to keep things up to a very high standard. As I found out when I first joined Prabhupada's party, I became his Masur, at least. The first day was November the 26th, 1975. Prabhupada was in New Delhi. And I'd gone into Prabhupada's room. I'd been instructed in the daytime by Upendra Prabhu about how to do Prabhupada's massage, and I was told to come back in the evening and see how to do the evening massage. So when I came in, Prabhupada had just finished eating. He just had like an evening snack. And his plate was there sitting on the table. So unexpectedly, Prabhupada asked me to remove the plate and wash it. So there was also another item there. There was some fruit that had been given to Prabhupada, it's kind of like a dakshina. So that was sitting in a basket underneath the table. So Prabhupada told me, take the plate and wash it, and then take the fruit and give it to the temple, and they can offer it to the deities. So I picked up Prabhupada's plate in one hand and the fruit basket in the other, and I started for the door. But Prabhupada immediately stopped me. He pointed out that the plate, having been eaten from, was dirty. I had picked it up, contaminating myself by touching it, and then I had touched the fruit that was to be offered to the deities. He told me to wash my hands and to take the items separately. We all smiled at his thoughtfulness and my dullness. From my point of view as a disciple, both Guru and God are to be worshipped on the same level. Foremost in my mind was the thought that every little opportunity to render some service was for my benefit. In other words, I thought that I was becoming purified simply by touching the plate that Srila Prabhupada had personally eaten from. Prabhupada, however, thought of himself as a humble servant of Krishna. Thus he saw the plate as being contaminated. Because he has such a high standard of purity, and because the fruit was to be offered to the deity, Prabhupada could therefore not accept the mixing of the two items. In Prabhupada's presence, it's becoming quite clear how little I have learned in almost 4 years in the movement. Being with Srila Prabhupada is opening up a whole new perspective on devotional service to me. As Prabhupada's assistant, One has to learn to see matters from his point of view, and that takes precedent over one's own. Then there was a similar incident 2 nights later. Again, I was in Prabhupada's room. He'd been he'd been eating from his plate, and he told me to get some water in the jug. So I picked the 2 items up, and immediately Prabhupada stopped me again, the same thing. You contaminate it. As soon as you pick something up that's been eaten from, you contaminate it. So then if you pick something else up that has to be utilized, that immediately also becomes contaminated. Prabhupada was very sharp on these particular points. So November the 27th, so this was after I'd given Prabhupada my first massage. And I discovered that, of course, Harikesh was cooking, and then Hasaduta, he was the secretary. So after Prabhupada had eaten, then they would sit down and they would share Prabhupada's remnants. So I was naturally in on that. And so after taking lunch, Prabhupada was sitting at ease in his sitting room for a short while. So then to get into his bedroom to take his afternoon nap, he always had an hour's nap after lunch, then he had to come through the servant's room. So as he walked through the servant's room to his bedroom to retire for his afternoon nap, Hasaduta, Harikesh and I were sitting in the servant's room taking our lunch. As Prabhupada came in, we offered our obeisances. I was sitting on the floor eating from a bowl with a spoon, and as I knelt back, I put the spoon down and then I rested my hands on my knees. Immediately Prabhupada looked at me and he said, "Oh, you were eating and then?" And he started putting his hands like this on different parts of his body, as if to illustrate a small child contaminating his clothes with his dirty hands. My instinct was to say, "Well, Srila Prabhupada, my hand isn't dirty, I'm eating with a spoon." But then I thought better of it and I checked myself. Prabhupada could obviously see that I was eating with a spoon. It was just that he had a better understanding of what constitutes cleanliness. So he laughed. As he walked past us, he walked into his bedroom. He shook his head and he said, "You're all brought up malachas." So then in the evening, again, this is the water jug incident, without first washing my hands, I picked up a water jug after handling Srila Prabhupada's plate. He immediately noticed and corrected me. He laughed and he told me not to mind. It is the position of the Guru, he said, to find out the faults in the disciple and rectify them. It was simultaneously embarrassing and pleasurable to be on the receiving end of Prabhupada's reproof. His standard of purity is so much higher than ours. By his keen observation and objective criticism, he is training us to the highest levels and making us fit for serving Krishna. I felt very fortunate that Prabhupada is very patiently training me. Even though he sometimes calls us malachas, he is actually very proud of his Western disciples. He constantly points out to his visitors how we have been transformed. These incidents have made me realize that Prabhupada has unlimited patience in training his disciples. Although he must have given these instructions hundreds of times during the last 10 years, he is still prepared to patiently teach the same things again and again to any new disciple, provided the student has an attitude of humble service and is eager to learn. So, it's small things that Prabhupada, must constantly, every time he got a new servant or a new secretary, or, whenever he toured, dealing with new disciples, he must have given these instructions again and again and again. But still, he was very patiently willing to do it. But the criteria was that you had to be very humble and, always willing and eager to serve and to learn new standards. So then there was a similar incident. Of course, a lot of cleanliness concerns prasadam. That's one of the important functions, and it's very important to be always clean when you're dealing with prasadam. So another incident that occurred was about a month or so later. We'd gone down south. We had a couple of days in Madras on the 1st and 2nd of January. And then from there we went by train to Nellore. That was about a 3-hour journey north. And we were staying with these sisters who was supposed to be giving this land to us. And then it turned out, of course, there was some trickery involved. We eventually rejected the place. But at least for 1 week, Prabhupada had stayed there and he did the groundbreaking ceremony and foundation stone ceremony for a new temple on this land that these sisters were giving us. So when we'd arrived there, it was kind of very odd because, you would think people that were donating land to the society, they're having Prabhupada come and actually stay with them for a week or so. There was a big pandal that was being arranged for every evening in the local town. So you think that, they'd be very happy, at the whole event. But when we got there, they were kind of very muted in their, reception. Kind of very cool. And it seemed a little odd. Then later on, as we settled in, we discovered that they were actually meat eaters. They had chickens, in the back garden. And, of course they were cooking meat in their kitchen and everything. So we were avoiding going into the kitchen. But anyway, I had to get some salt for Srila Prabhupada for his breakfast and lunch. So this was on the 4th of January. While preparing Prabhupada's lunch yesterday, I discovered that the only salt available came in large crystalline lumps that had to be broken up and crushed. Because this was somewhat troublesome, and plus I didn't want to go into the kitchen too often, I spent half an hour making enough for the following few days. And I put a small stone bowl containing the salt on Prabhupada's chonky. That's like the table that Prabhupada was eating from. So I assumed that Prabhupada would take as much salt from the stock that he wanted and then leave the rest for future use. During breakfast, however, Prabhupada started dipping pieces of fruit directly into the bowl rather than taking the salt from it onto his plate and leaving the rest. When I cleaned up afterwards, I left the salt bowl on the table, thinking that it would be all right to use for other meals. So, although conversing with other devotees, Srila Prabhupada, as observant as ever, noticed what I was doing and immediately rebuked me. So he was sitting at his desk, he finished eating, he moved over, he was talking with the Yashodanandan Swami, and at the same time as he was talking, he was watching me with his other eye. And he saw I cleaned the table and I left the salt pot on the table. Immediately he got me. Calling me a Yavana. He complained about our Western eating habits of saving the remnants of food. There's no taste, no vitamin, and still they eat. Harikesh asked if it would be alright if I kept the salt in the pot and then put some on the plate when Prabhupada took his prasadam. Prabhupada said, I do not know whether it is alright, but it is not alright that you eat and then keep it. That is not alright. Yashodanandan explained, he keeps the salt in a separate bowl, and when you require it, he will give you only as much as you require. Prabhupada said, yes, that is nice. Well, I said, well, that's why the bowl is there. That's why what I intended to do, but I have to keep it away from the table. Prabhupada said, the principle should be that you should not leave remnants of food. As soon as it is used, it should not be used more. Otherwise, it is not possible to give up. Param drishma nivartate. I am eating something not very superior, but if I get the chance to eat something superior, then I shall give up this inferior. So, you have to be very careful, especially about remnants of food once it's been eaten. That's it. Of course, prasadam is prasadam. It can be eaten or not eaten. There was a whole incident about that we had in Melbourne, which I'll mention in a minute. But another time when Prabhupada again pulled me up about, saving remnants of food or something that's already been cut and eaten, was when we were in Bombay in August 15th, 1976, and it was watermelon. There was a watermelon season. So in the afternoons after Prabhupada had his nap, he would wake up generally around 4:15 or 4 o'clock, and we would have a fresh flower garland. We'd put fresh sandalwood paste on his head, and we'd generally give him a cup full of fresh fruit juice, or sometimes we would give him some fresh fruit. One fruit that Prabhupada really liked was guava, because in his days in Allahabad, then in the summertime he told me that in the daytime, because it was very hot, then people wouldn't have a meal, but they would eat these, you get these very big guavas. So they just have one guava like that, and that would keep them going during the day. Then when the heat was less, then they would take their meals. So sometimes I was going out to the local market and buying, you know, some fresh guava and giving that to Srila Prabhupada. Or sometimes, you know, we would find some other fruit. So there's one occasion, there was watermelon was available. So the melons are so large that I only used a portion, and I saved the rest in the refrigerator for later use. Srila Prabhupada happened to notice it. I opened the fridge door and he saw it in the fridge door. And he stopped and he said, "Cut fruit must be distributed immediately." And he made me take it out and distribute it. He didn't like keeping, you know, it stored up in the refrigerator. So refrigeration, of course, was one thing that Prabhupada wasn't that keen on, at least frozen food. That was another thing. But anyway, the point was that once something's been, you know, eaten or it's been cut up, then immediately it has to be distributed. Otherwise, it's not fresh. After a few hours, then it becomes, you know, technically contaminated. Or, you know, as Prabhupada mentions in the Gita, any food that's been cooked 3 hours before, then that's considered to be in the mode of ignorance. Yeah? So everything has to be very fresh. That's the Vedic principle. Now, there was one controversy that did come up. I usually mention this story in the Prasadam seminar, but since we're not going to do that, I'll mention it now because it's kind of an interesting incident. In 1975, when I was in the Melbourne temple, that was before I went to stay in India and before I became Prabhupada's servant. So Prabhupada had come in May of 75 and he had opened the new temple in Melbourne. And then not long after that, then the Chaitanya Charitamrita started coming out. There were already a couple of volumes, but in 75 that was when the whole complete set of Chaitanya Charitamrita was finally printed. So we got them, and you know, everybody was eagerly reading them, and then we started reading all these things about, you know, prasadam and charanamrita, and you know, how if you spill charanamrita on the floor, you get, you know, birth as a life, seven lifetimes, and all this kind of stuff. Anyway, so in reading about prasadam, you know, we, at least Madhavisa Swami anyway, he was the GVC at that time, he got this understanding that, you know, you can't, it's offensive to prasadam to throw it away. So, you know, every Sunday you have the Sunday feast, we get so many visitors, serve them a plate of prasadam, and very often they won't eat everything. They leave the, you know, the remnants on the plate. So up until that time, our system had been that, you know, we'd scrape off the plates, put all the prasadam in a bin, and then we'd run it down the coast and throw it in the ocean. You know, and then the fishes would get to eat it. So that was, you know, we'd done that for quite a few years. But then after we read all these things about prasadam and the sanctity of prasadam and the Chaitanya Charitamrita, Madhavisa came to the conclusion that it was offensive to throw away all the, you know, extra prasadam. So what he ordered us to do was that after the Sunday feast, all the remnants had to be scraped off the plates, all the leftovers, and put on trays. And then on Monday morning, that was breakfast. Yeah, so we had to, you know, take the trays and we heat up, you know, the leftover prasadam. And so some devotees, of course, weren't keen on eating it. You know, some devotees were protesting. Other devotees were saying, no, it's prasadam, it's never contaminated, it's an offense to refuse to take it. And then other ones were saying, well, all right, the prasadam's not contaminated, but the saliva from the karmis' mouths is all over it, so, you know, and we're not going to eat that. So it became a big controversy. So anyway, just not long after that, that was when I moved to India. And then after a couple of weeks, Prabhupada came back to Vrindavan for the Janmashtami festival. So I'd gone in on the first day for, Prabhupada's darshan, and he recognized me as being from Australia. He didn't know me by name at that time, but Prabhupada had a fantastic memory. He had thousands of disciples, but as soon as he saw me, he remembered that I was from Australia. So he immediately asked me, how is everything in Australia and like this, how's the new temple in Melbourne? And so it became an opportunity to ask a question about this prasadam episode. So then I asked Srila Prabhupada, I explained what was going on, and then I said, now, nobody really knows if it's offensive or not offensive like this. Should we take the leftovers, or should we throw it away, or what should we do? So then Prabhupada thought about it for a little while, and then he said, it depends on your consciousness. He said if somebody's advanced in consciousness, then he may take. It's prasadam, so actually it's always spiritual. But he said if he's not in that advanced consciousness, then it's alright if he doesn't take it. So, it was ambivalent. It depends on the state of consciousness, whether you take the prasadam or not. Anyway, just a little point there about leftovers, if it's prasadam. So, alright, let's have a look at some more incidences. This was on February the 7th, 1976. Again, Prabhupada got me. After lunch, he liked to sit out on the veranda of the Lotus building just outside his rooms, and he would sit and look out over the front gate towards the Ganges there. Tamal Krsna Maharaj was there. He was Prabhupada's secretary. So we liked to come and sit with Srila Prabhupada for a few minutes, like in between. He wouldn't take rest immediately after eating, but he would sit for 15 or 20 minutes, chant a little japa, and then he would go and take rest. So it's just to let the digestive process kick in, and then he would go and lie down. So he was sitting out on the veranda on his chair, and Tamal Krsna Maharaj and I, we were going out every day and just sitting with him, sitting on the ground. So I knew Prabhupada liked to, have a glass of water. And so I had this silver glass that we carried with us, with water in it, just in case Prabhupada wanted to have a drink. So then Prabhupada asked me for a drink of water. So as I reached out for his silver cup, in my eagerness to serve, I moved too quickly, and I caught the top edge of the cup with the palm of my hand and almost knocked it over. So in the act of recovery, I kind of clipped it like this and I grabbed it. So I poked the tip of my finger into the water. So then I was caught in a dilemma. Should I inconvenience Srila Prabhupada by making him wait while I emptied the cup and got fresh water? Or should I just offer him the cup even though my finger had touched the contents? So I offered him the glass. Wrong decision. Prabhupada shook his head and he gave me a sour look. Then he laughed and he quoted from Bhagavad Gita, Pravittim cha nirvittim cha janana vidurasura. You are simply a Malacha. Because that verse is, Pravittim cha nirvittim cha. The asuras, janana vidurasura. The asuras don't know what is to be done and what is not to be done. So, in an attempt to rectify my bad habits, I've begun to take 3 baths daily. One on rising, one just before Prabhupada's massage, and again another one in the late afternoon. Still, it seems to be very difficult to know what a fitting standard of cleanliness is, although due to Prabhupada's association, I'm gradually learning. The other evening, I told Prabhupada that sometimes I wonder if I'll ever come up to the correct standards. Brahminical cleanliness just doesn't seem to come naturally. I explained that at home, before I'd become a devotee, I'd been practiced to bathe not more than once a week. That was the standard, Friday night was bath night, that's it. My mother's still the same thing. Friday night's bath night, once a week, that's it, that's. So I was brought up that way, It was only when I became a devotee, actually just before I became a devotee, I'd been working for 6 months in a mining camp in northwest Australia, and you got so filthy during the day you had to take a bath morning and evening, So I actually got a little practice just before I moved into the temple with bathing every day. But anyway, I was telling Prabhupada it just seems very artificial, you know, learning all these standards of cleanliness. So Prabhupada assured me I will learn gradually. But he also laughingly agreed that for a Westerner to be clean is somehow a very artificial condition. So we don't have, I mean, compared to Vedic standards, we're just not clean. That's, you know, Western culture. So another incident, cleanliness, and again, prasadam. This was December 16th, 1976, so by this time I'd been with Srila Prabhupada a year. I'd actually learnt a little something about, you know, cleanliness standards. So at that time, Prabhupada's cook was Arundhati. She was the wife of Pradyumna Prabhu. So Pradyumna was Prabhupada's Sanskrit editor. Arundhati was a very expert transcriber of Prabhupada's dictations. Whatever he, you know, translated in the night time, she would get the tapes first thing in the morning and she'd sit there and type them all out, really. And she was very expert at that. She was also cooking for Prabhupada because his regular cook at that time was not available. She wasn't that good of a cook. Sometimes she got it right, sometimes not. Jai Sri Sri Gunatai Ki Jai. So anyway, she was cooking. And they also had their son, Aniruddha, with them. So Aniruddha was traveling, you know, with the party. He was only 6 or 7 years old at that time. And they were kind of homeschooling him. But of course, a lot of the time he was, you know, roaming around and, you know, running around. So we were staying out on the Hyderabad farm. So, you know, big area, big, you know, lots of places for him to roam around. And this particular morning on the 16th of December, I saw Aniruddha, Arundhati's son, running across the yard with a puppy in his arms. You know? So of course in India the dogs are, you know, they're dirty. I mean, they're not domesticated. These animals are just living on the street. So I told him to put the dog down because it was dirty. Later on, he came into the kitchen at Prabhupada's house where Prabhupada was, where his mother was preparing Prabhupada's lunch. Prabhupada had finished bathing and he had sat down in his darshan room ready to take his meal. So as a special treat, Arundhati gave Prabhupada's plate to Aniruddha to carry into him. I saw that he was wearing the same clothes on that he'd been wearing in the morning when he was carrying the dog. I went into the kitchen and I told Arundhati off for allowing him into the kitchen and handling Prabhupada's plate because it couldn't be guaranteed that he would be clean. She was also giving him things to eat inside the kitchen. An argument developed with her becoming very upset and bursting into tears and angrily threatening that unless he could come into the kitchen to be with her, then she wouldn't cook anymore. So that made me even more agitated that she could take her service to Prabhupada so cheaply. Srila Prabhupada was just in the next room and he heard all the commotion, so he called me in to find out what was going on. I explained about Aniruddha and the dog and my objection and Arundhati's refusal to comply. So Prabhupada got up and came into the kitchen to see her. He asked Aniruddha if he had been carrying the dog, which he honestly admitted to. Arundhati told Srila Prabhupada that she had made him wash his hands before handling the plate. So after hearing both sides, Prabhupada explained to her in a very kindly way that actually it was a fact that the boy should not come into the kitchen because he was young and it was not possible for him to remain clean. He told her one should take bath before entering the kitchen, just as in the deity room also. These two places are to be kept very, very clean. These rules must be observed. They are there so that we can avoid seva aparad. So Arundhati accepted that, but still she said that Aniruddha wanted to be with her while she was cooking, and she also needed to know where he was while she was cooking, and he also gets hungry at around that time and he needs to be fed. So Prabhupada intelligently gave the solution. If it was not possible for them to be separated, he said, Aniruddha can remain at the door just on the back veranda. He may not come in, but through the door he can see his mother, and she can also instruct him. And if he wants something to eat, then he can be given something just outside the door. He told her that attachment between mother and son is natural, but there is also the question of training. She calmed down, accepting Prabhupada's advice as a good solution, and she ended up smiling again. I was also happy to have had Prabhupada's backing on a strong stand that I had taken. So Prabhupada was able to satisfy all parties. Going back into his room, Prabhupada then called me in, and he added an extra piece of advice. He said that as a matter of etiquette, if I have some instruction to give to her, it should be done through her husband or through himself, but I should not directly approach her. I learnt one other striking lesson from the event, how material attachment causes one to lose one's intelligence and good discrimination, and thereby puts one in a position where one commits offences. Arundhati knew that it was wrong to allow her son into the kitchen, but because of her identifying, "Oh, this is my son," she insisted that he be allowed in, even to the point of threatening to give up her personal service of a spiritual master. Such is the power of Maya. So that was my little realization from it. Anyway, the point is that cleanliness is very important. And as Prabhupada said, with children, there's no way, kids can be clean. So therefore they have to be trained. There's attachment, that's fine, but still there's training as well. So that's the parents' duties. So cleanliness then anyway is very important. And as a culture, of course, Indian culture was originally based on Brahminical culture. At least that was, Brahminical standard was there, and that was to be aspired to, even if, most of the population were not real Brahmins. But still there's that standard there. So Prabhupada used to talk about Indian culture then, and this, idea of cleanliness. So on April the 22nd, he was in Melbourne, and we were waiting for some people to come for a darshan, and in the meantime, myself and Pushta Krishna Maharaj, who was his secretary, we were just chatting in Prabhupada's room with him. So Prabhupada was reposed on his asana. He said that Western people have no understanding of proper cleanliness. We do not bathe regularly, whereas in India the Brahmanas bathe not once, but 3 times daily, changing their clothing each time. Then he mildly reproached me again because of the numerous occasions he has had to correct my bad habits. He said that he is showing by his own example, washing his hands even after just taking medicine, but we are not learning. I tried to reassure him that I am gradually learning. He gave a wry half smile and he shook his head. I do not know how long you will learn. He told us that in India, the utensils used for cooking must be very, very clean. If a black portion remains, a Brahmana cook will not touch them. Even on the bottom, on the outside, Pushta Krishna asked, yes, they'll not touch. Oh, it is still dirty. But in our temples, it is going on. What can be done? Prabhupada told us that our mentality considers it sufficient to rub dirty things with a little soap. But he said that is not cleanliness. He told us about his mother's strict standards. If there is a black spot on the pot, it will immediately be cleansed. My mother used to see every utensil, whether there is any spot. The maidservant had to surrender and examine. And when there is no spot, then it is finished. Otherwise she has to do again. So everything should be neat and clean. The kitchen should be very neat and clean, and washed twice daily, opened nicely and smeared with water and cow dung. And if you see the kitchen, immediately you will feel comfortable. Food is very cleanly prepared and then offered to the deity, and then you take, and automatically your mind becomes cleansed. So it's a science. If the surroundings are clean, and if what you're eating is clean, then internally you also become affected by that. You become cleansed. Actually, when you're eating, there's not just a physical component, but there's a subtle component also. If a lusty person is cooking, the lust his lusty mentality actually goes into the food. According to Ayurveda, there's a solid portion, there's a liquid portion, and there's a subtle portion, just as we have a subtle body and a gross body. In the same way, food also. So when you eat that, if you eat something that's cooked by a lusty person, your mind becomes agitated with lusty desires simply by eating the food that they've cooked. If you eat something that's pure, it's been, especially of course if it's been offered to Krishna, the same effect. Yeah, because it's spiritual, then you become spiritualized just by eating spiritual foodstuffs. So Prabhupada was making that point. Automatically, if you're in a clean place and what you're eating is clean, then automatically the mind becomes cleansed. Science. So there was another incident when later on we were down in Hyderabad, and this was on the 25th of August. We'd had the temple opening, and at that time there was some interest being shown by some members of the Mawari community. So the Mawaris, they have their own particular culture, usually fairly high standard, and generally you find that most Mawaris are strictly vegetarian. Not many other communities now in India still keep their standards, but the Mawaris do. And they're also, you know, like the rich sector of Indian society. Sometimes people say they're the Jews of India, because the Jewish community in Europe, because they were always the wealthy community. That was why Hitler was so envious of them, because they had all the money. So in India, the Mawaris, they're also well-known, you know, rich community. So they'd not shown much interest in ISKCON up until this point. But then Mahamsa, Mahamsa Swami, he was in Hyderabad, he had started getting some contacts, and then they saw the temple opening and they became very interested. So there was a program on this particular morning at the house of one of the leading Mawari businessmen. So formally the Mawari community has not paid very much attention to us. But after Mahamsa showed a leading member of their community some films on Srila Prabhupada's work and ISKCON, he became so impressed that he encouraged many others to contribute to the temple construction. So I was surprised when we arrived at this wealthy man's house to see that it was quite dilapidated and practically unfurnished, save for a few old, unvarnished wooden chairs and tables. Srila Prabhupada explained that this is the reason why they are so successful at making money. They never spend it. We entered a large, almost empty room where they had a deity. Prabhupada sat down and he gave a short speech. Then a local brahmana, along with a young boy, loudly chanted the slokas from the Sri Ishopanishad. They accompanied each intonation with various hand movements, and Prabhupada liked it very much. You know, just to keep the meter, they would move their hands like this, whatever. Some kind of mudras. I don't know whether they were specific mudras or just, you know, chanting in time, and to keep the time they were moving their hands. But anyway, Prabhupada liked it. He had me record it as well. So when we arrived back at the temple, Mahamsa told Srila Prabhupada that the leader of the Mawaris had been in attendance at that program. He would now most likely give a substantial donation, one which every other businessman would then have to match. So in order to keep face, you know, if the leader of the community, if he gave 50,000, everybody else had to give 50,000 just to keep the prestige up. So it's, you know, it's a science. If you want to know how to collect, then you have to know how their minds work. So Mahamsa also commented on the rundown state of the house and the surrounding neighbourhood. He said that they were all crore patties. Of course, a crore is 10 million rupees. In those days, that was $1 million. So they're all millionaires, he said, yet they were living in slums. Prabhupada said, though, that to live very gorgeously is not good. And he also pointed out that still the place was very clean. Their cooking pots, he said, were spotless, whereas in the house of a Parsi man that he had once visited in Bombay, he saw that all the pots were black underneath. Mahamsa was a Parsi. He had come from the Parsi community. So he said, all right, you know, basically he was saying, all right, you're criticizing them, but this is what I've seen in the Parsi community. So he said, nothing is cleansed. For eating, they use this china, So clean or unclean, it cannot be understood. It's simply washed. And then talking about our own temples, he observed, when it is handled by this European and American devotees, the black, downside, it is black. It should not be black. It should be cleansed. Not even you can see any black spot, then it is clean. If there's a single black spot, then it is not clean. So you can check your pots now. See? He said in his school days, even the house of a sweeper was so clean that you would like to go and sit there. The lowest class person, the toilet cleaners, they would bathe 2 or 3 times a day. And all their utensils in their living quarters were clean. So this was Hindu culture, he said. He said cleanliness is very essential, especially in the temple. If you were lazy, then you cannot keep clean. Oh, let me sleep for the time being. That is the mode of ignorance, he said, tamagun. So we have to conquer over tamagun and rajagun. And then there is the question of coming to the platform of Sudasattva. So, cleanliness for Westerners, Prabhupada noted it. And when he went around, of course, he wouldn't always say it, but he always saw it. And sometimes he would comment on it. And so again, there was another incident in Prabhupada's room in 1977. We were in Mayapur. Prabhupada was speaking with Guru Kripa Swami about some managerial matters. I was in the room, but I was sitting at the back. And Prabhupada was speaking directly with Guru Kripa. So as he was speaking with Guru Kripa, he had his eye on me. So, since it didn't directly concern me, I wasn't paying much attention. So I was sitting back and I was kind of poking in my pockets. I had one of these, waistcoat, cutty vests on. And I found a toothpick in my vest pocket. So I absent-mindedly took it out and started poking my teeth with it. Srila Prabhupada, while speaking with Guru Kripa, was also watching me with his other eye. He suddenly stopped. "Why are you not paying attention?" he asked, a little annoyed. "This is not just for him, it is for you also. And what is this? You're always playing with your nose and fingers. This is your bad habit. Now go and wash your hands." So he made me go out and wash my hands. Embarrassed, I went out to the bathroom. And when I came back into Prabhupada's room, Guru Kripa had gone. I told Srila Prabhupada that somehow or another, although I know what the standards of cleanliness are, it just doesn't come naturally. Prabhupada laughed, and he agreed that for a Westerner, to be clean is artificial. Still, he said, with practice it will come. So, Prabhupada had very high standards, personally. In 1976, when Tamal Krishna Maharaj joined the party as Prabhupada's secretary, we immediately flew down to Madras. He came on the morning of January the 1st. He arrived about like 5:30, and then I think by about 8 or 9 o'clock in the morning, then we actually flew straight down to Madras. He'd come into Bombay. So Prabhupada took his breakfast on the aeroplane. When he finished, he washed his fingers with water from his glass, and then he took a sip from the glass. Tamal Krishna Maharaj was closely observing Srila Prabhupada eat. He turned to me and he commented, "Just see how expert and cultured Srila Prabhupada is. He washed his hands first and then he drank. If he had drunk from the glass first, then the water would have been contaminated and then he wouldn't have been able to wash his hands with it." So it's a small point, but it's refinement. That's how Prabhupada was. And of course, Prabhupada was famous for drinking water by tipping the glass. He would never put it to his mouth. He would always pour it in so that the mouth didn't come in contact with the glass. So like that. And also when Prabhupada was eating, I noted, he never licked his fingers or poked his fingers into his mouth. Even when he was eating, he would break off and just pop the prasadam into his mouth. You'd never see him licking his hands. So, and of course for bathing. Now Prabhupada mentioned the Brahmanas, they bathe 3 times a day. And there were some letters, I kind of did a little bit of brief research just to look and see. I remembered that when I was in Australia, before I came to India, There was a letter that one time it came out, and I think it was sent to Madhudvisa. I looked for it in folio. I've not been able to find it, so I don't know what happened. But I remember that Prabhupada sent a letter out once where it was mentioned that sannyasis bathe 3 times a day, a householder bathes twice a day, and a brahmachari once a day. And I remembered at the time when I heard that, it seemed to be back to front, because I had this, this impression. Well, a sannyasi is to be, supposed to be the purest. So why does he have to bathe 3 times a day? If you're bathing more times a day, it's because you're dirty, and therefore you need to be bathing more times. If you're pure, then you don't have to bathe as many times. But of course, the opposite is true. The symptom of your purity is that you do bathe more than once a day. Right? That's why you're pure, because you bathe 3 times a day. So sannyasis bathe 3 times a day. Householders twice a day, because the householder, because you bathe when you get up in the morning. And then you have to go out and work. So after working in the day, you come back, the first thing is that you have to bathe. And then of course brahmachari is only once a day, because everybody knows brahmacharis, as Prabhupada said, means it will be dirty. So anyway, there was a letter that Prabhupada also he sent to Hanuman Prasad Poda in 1970, where he mentioned that the devotees take bath twice daily. And again, there was another letter, 1970, to Kanchabala, where Prabhupada tells her that we shall touch the deity altar and the deity in a very clean condition after taking bath and washing the mouth nicely. Practice washing hands after eating and wash with soap and water after toilet. Cleanliness is next to godliness, so this point should be very carefully observed. Then you will advance very quickly to the perfectional stage of Krishna consciousness. And then again, a letter to Madhudvisa. This was in 1975. This was just after I joined Prabhupada's party, actually, December the 7th. And Prabhupada always, when he sent initiation letters, acceptance letters out, especially, people that had applied for Brahmin initiation, then Prabhupada practically always, he would remind them that instruct the newly initiated Brahmins about cleanliness, taking bath 3 times daily, taking bath each time after passing stool. Cleanliness within and without, that is very important for Brahminical life. So Prabhupada, of course, he had his standard. When I was traveling with Prabhupada, Prabhupada only bathed once a day, and I'll mention why in a minute. But he always, kept that standard up. Although in some circumstances, if he was really sick sometimes, then he wasn't able to do that. But Srila Kirti writes about an amusing incident in his book, What is the Difficulty? That just came out last year. So he's got a lot of little anecdotes there about Prabhupada. And one of them was really funny when Prabhupada was traveling. So he mentions there that on a flight from India to the West, we had a 2-hour stopover in the Bangkok airport and had to wait in the transit area. Get my things, Prabhupada told me. I'm going to shower. So this is Srila Kirti talking. I went to the baggage area, opened up Prabhupada's bag, grabbed his lota, towel, and a fresh change of clothing. After a few minutes, I returned to His Divine Grace. Where is the bathroom, he asked. So we walked together to the bathroom, but unfortunately there was no bathing facility. But Prabhupada was not so easily discouraged. For him, there was never an obstacle. Assessing the situation, he turned to me and he said, "All right, I'll take my bath from the sink." After putting on his gumption, he poured water over his body again and again from his lota. He's standing at the sink, right, and pouring the water over. He's standing in the middle of the toilets there, And he washed with soap, and then he rinsed it all off. I watched in amazement as he refreshed himself. He was transcendental to all the other activities going on around him. The attendant was watching from the corner of the bathroom. He looked disturbed at seeing all the extra work that was being created for him, because the whole floor was covered in soap and water. He had no idea that he was being benedicted by a Paramahamsa. He was getting the opportunity to do pujari work by the causeless mercy of Srila Prabhupada. I gave Prabhupada a towel when he was finished. He dried himself and then dressed in a clean dhoti and kurta. The attendant approached me as we were walking out of the bathroom. Although I had no idea what he was saying, I knew that he was complaining, and Prabhupada laughed. Srila Prabhupada, I said as we walked out, I think he's a little upset. Oh well, Prabhupada replied, I had to take my bath. I was feeling very tired. So anyway, Prabhupada always kept his schedule, you know. He had his massage every day, he had his bath every day. You know, there were certain things that he always maintained because he had to keep his body fit for his preaching work. Another kind of similar incident to that occurred when I was with Prabhupada. This was on March the 20th in 1976, and he went out to Haridaspur. Now, Haridaspur is right on the border with Bangladesh, and we'd been offered some land there. Thakur Haridas had stayed there, and so Prabhupada went there, and we had like a little festival. You know, this man Prabhu Swarup, who was running the place, this small ashram, he had seen ISKCON, he got interested, he realized we had a lot of money, he had nothing, he wanted to develop his ashram, and so he made a deal basically with Srila Prabhupada that he would turn it over to ISKCON and we would develop it. So he wanted Prabhupada and the devotees to come out to his ashram at Haridaspur and just, you know, get some advertisement like that. So Prabhupada left by car in the early morning, a drive which took 3 hours. Haridaspur is named after Thakur Haridas, the great Acharya of the Holy Name, to commemorate his stay there. The man's ashram turned out to be a small cottage situated on 6 bighas of land, that's 2 acres, on the outskirts of the village, with a small run-down shrine to Haridas Thakur. Prabhupada spent 4 hours in a derelict single-room brick building with only gaping holes for the door, roof and windows. Right? It's just bricks. In India sometimes it's a curious thing. I don't know whether it's just West Bengal or everywhere, but you often see these kind of half-finished buildings. You know, they put the walls up and then leave it. And there's no window, the holes are there, but there's no door, there's no window, there's no roof. You know, just like a shell, and somehow or another they don't ever seem to finish them. Anyway, it was the same thing there. And the floor was just, you know, overgrown earthen floor. Some, you know, weeds and things growing up. And this is where Prabhupada had to spend 4 hours. So we had to hang our chatters over the openings to give him some privacy while he took his breakfast, then he had his massage, then he took his bath and lunch, all in that same little area. So Prabhupada even bathed in